What made the 60s so dangerously bold on film screens across the world? It was a decade where rebellion and artistry collided under the watchful eyes of censors who feared change more than chaos. These were movies that defied purity laws, mocked authority, and dared to show human darkness as truth. Let's step into 17 films that terrified censors, yet transformed cinema forever. Number 17, The Pawnbroker, 1964. When The Pawnbroker premiered, it broke barriers no American film had ever crossed before. Directed by Sidney Lumet and starring Rod Steiger, it told the story of Sol Nazerman, a Holocaust survivor running a pawn shop in Harlem. Haunted by memories of concentration camps and tormented by survivors' guilt, Nazerman's cold detachment slowly unravels before the audience. It was not the violence, but the emotional exposure that rattled the censors. The production code still ruled Hollywood, and The Pawnbroker included a brief moment of nudity that sent the censors into panic. Lumet refused to cut it, arguing it was vital to portray human vulnerability, stripped bare of illusions. The scene stayed after much protest, making it the first American feature to break the code's visual barrier. Audiences were stunned. Some critics hailed it as a new chapter in honest filmmaking, others denounced it as indecent. But history sided with Lumet. His defiance became the first crack in a censorship wall that would crumble by the decade's end. The film's legacy lives as the moment when American cinema dared to feel again. Number 16, Blow Up, 1966. Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up was the scandal that London's swinging 60s never expected. It followed a fashion photographer who may or may not have photographed a murder in a park. Yet what shocked audiences was not death, but the film's hypnotic emptiness. The moral fog of youth culture captured through jazz pop art and blurred morality. The British Board of Film Censors was horrified. They demanded edits, claiming the film's sensual scenes and moral ambiguity were dangerous to public order. Antonioni refused. He believed censorship itself was the illusion society hid behind. The Vatican condemned it, and America's own ratings board refused its classification, forcing MGM to release it unrated. A daring move that sparked protests and fascination alike. The chaos worked in its favor. Blow Up became a box office hit, inspiring countless filmmakers to challenge narrative and censorship norms. Its influence echoed in films like Clute and The Conversation, proving that the act of watching could be more provocative than the act itself. To this day, Blow Up stands as a mirror to an age intoxicated by beauty, yet terrified of meaning. Number 15, The Servant, 1963. Before British cinema embraced free expression, there was The Servant, a slow psychological detonation disguised as a chamber drama. Directed by Joseph Losey and written by Harold Pinter, it starred Dirk Bogarde as a manipulative manservant who gradually dismantles his wealthy employer's life and identity. What began as social commentary turned into a disturbing exploration of dominance and submission. The British censors squirmed. The Servant never used explicit imagery, but its tone was dripping with forbidden tension. The power reversals, the ambiguous intimacy, the quiet degradation. All of it suggested relationships society refused to name. The result was a scandal masked in art house prestige. Behind the scenes, Losey, a blacklisted American exile, and Pinter, an emerging playwright, clashed with studios terrified of controversy. But the film triumphed through sheer audacity. Critics called it hypnotic, poisonous, unforgettable. The Servant opened doors for more psychologically daring works that questioned class morality and repression itself. Its shadow lingered long after the final frame. In a time obsessed with control, The Servant whispered that power is the most corrupting illusion of all. Number 14, Belle de Jour, 1967. When Belle de Jour arrived, it detonated like a cinematic scandal disguised as poetry. Directed by Luis Buñuel and starring Catherine Deneuve, this French masterpiece blurred the line between repression and imagination in a way that left moral guardians trembling. Deneuve played Séverine, a quiet bourgeois housewife whose sterile life with her husband hides another existence altogether, an emotional hunger that leads her into secret encounters during the afternoons. But what shook the establishment was not what was shown. It was what Buñuel refused to explain. Every scene balanced between dream and reality. Severine's fantasies of humiliation and desire merged with her daytime escapades until no one could tell which world was real. French censors tried to label it immoral while Catholic authorities condemned it as blasphemy. The film was briefly banned in several countries, including parts of South America, where church influence remained powerful. Behind the scenes, the chaos was relentless. Deneuve feared the role would destroy her image, yet Buñuel was relentless in crafting emotional precision without sensationalism. He used suggestion over exposure and irony over vulgarity. When it finally premiered at Venice, it won the Golden Lion, while being booed and applauded in equal measure. Audiences were split between fascination and outrage. Yet, Belle de Jour reshaped cinematic language forever. It proved that true daring lies in ambiguity, not shock. It inspired generations from Kubrick to Lynch, teaching them that the forbidden can be whispered more powerfully than shouted. Today, its surreal detachment still feels subversive, a quiet rebellion wrapped in elegance, reminding us that what we repress defines us more than what we reveal. Number 13. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? 1966. Few films tore down Hollywood's hypocrisy like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Directed by Mike Nichols and starring Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, the film dragged marital warfare onto the screen with such ferocity that censors panicked. Adapted from Edward Albee's stage play, it followed George and Martha, a middle-aged couple locked in a night of drunken truth-telling with another younger pair. What began as dinner became destruction. This was the movie that broke the old production code for good. Taylor unleashed language no studio had ever dared approve, words that felt like emotional knives. The Catholic Legion of Decency branded it morally repulsive and refused its classification. Yet Warner Brothers refused to back down. Nichols and producer Ernest Lehman fought for realism, arguing that the dialogue was essential to human honesty. Behind the camera, the tension mirrored the script. Taylor and Burton's real-life marriage was crumbling under alcohol and fame. Their arguments bled into their performances, creating an authenticity that terrified observers. Censors attempted to mute scenes and rewrite dialogue, but Nichols used every trick, shadow lighting, deep focus close-ups, to maintain intensity without vulgarity. When it finally premiered, it became the first major film released under the newly forming rating system, effectively ending the censorship code that had ruled since the 1930s. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece of raw truth. The Academy nominated it for 13 Oscars, and it won 5. Its legacy was liberation, proving that honesty in art could be more dangerous than any image. To this day, it remains a reminder that the most shocking thing cinema can show is human reality unmasked. Number 12. The War Game, 1965. In a decade terrified of nuclear annihilation, The War Game dared to show the unshowable. Directed by Peter Watkins for the BBC, it imagined what would happen if Britain suffered a nuclear strike. Told in faux documentary style, the film depicted panic chaos, starvation, and social collapse. It was so realistic that many viewers mistook it for actual footage when it finally leaked years later. The BBC banned it immediately, calling it too horrifying for public broadcast. Officials feared mass hysteria, claiming the public was not ready to see such destruction on screen. The government privately agreed. For 20 years, it remained locked in archives unseen except by a few festival juries. Yet it went on to win the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, an irony so perfect it only added to its legend. Behind the scenes, Watkins battled bureaucracy and censorship committees. His realistic techniques, non-professional actors, handheld cameras, statistical narration made the terror feel documentary true. Politicians accused him of spreading anti-nuclear propaganda. Others whispered that he had exposed the state's lack of preparedness. The BBC executives panicked, pulling all promotion and scheduling the film's broadcast only to cancel it. At the last moment, when audiences finally saw it in the 1980s, they were stunned by how modern it still felt. Its imagery of burned cities and terrified civilians influenced later works like Threads and The Day After. The War Game remains a symbol of truth suppressed by fear, proof that the most dangerous films are those that dare to imagine the unthinkable. It was banned for honesty, not horror, reminding the world that silence can be far more terrifying than apocalypse itself. Number 11. Lolita, 1962. Stanley Kubrick's Lolita was not merely a film, but an act of cultural provocation. Based on Vladimir Nabokov's infamous novel, it pushed the boundaries of what American studios dared to touch. The story followed Humbert Humbert, a middle-aged intellectual whose obsession with a teenage girl shatters his life and those around him. But what Kubrick created was not exploitation. It was an exposé of moral decay hidden behind suburban charm. From the moment the project was announced, censors mobilized. The Catholic Legion of Decency called it unfilmable, and the Production Code Authority demanded major changes. Kubrick played a dangerous game of suggestion and implication, using shadow humor and irony instead of direct depiction. Peter Sellers' performance as Claire Quilty added surreal menace, turning the story into a dark satire of obsession and hypocrisy. Filming was fraught with fear and compromise. Kubrick shot scenes in coded language, avoiding anything that would bring a ban. Yet the tension between what was shown and what was implied made it more disturbing. Sue Lyon, barely 16, became the focus of both fascination and controversy. Critics accused Kubrick of moral corruption, while others praised his audacity to tackle the subject with intelligence rather than shock. When it premiered in 1962, audiences lined up in curiosity and outrage. The film's tagline, "How did they ever make a movie of Lolita?" became its own dare. Some countries banned it outright, while others demanded heavy editing. Despite all that, it became a success, proving that implication could be more powerful than exposure. Kubrick's subtle defiance marked the decline of the old production code and paved the way for the modern rating system. Lolita's legacy endures as a haunting reminder that cinema's boldest power lies in suggestion, not spectacle. Number 10. The Damned, 1969. Luchino Visconti's The Damned was a nightmare dressed in elegance, a study of a wealthy German family descending into moral rot during the rise of Nazism. Released at the twilight of the decade, it became one of the most controversial European films ever made. It was operatic shocking and visually overwhelming, a reflection of how power and corruption mirror each other. The film's premiere at Cannes caused riots and walkouts. Critics were torn between awe and revulsion. Some called it genius, others called it perversion. Censors across Europe demanded cuts not because of one specific act, but because of the film's overall depravity. The sense that Visconti had dared to look directly into humanity's abyss. The Nazi imagery was raw and unfiltered. The themes of decadence and manipulation frightened both moralists and politicians. Behind the camera, Visconti, a proud aristocrat and Marxist, faced immense pressure from studios, terrified of lawsuits and bans. Yet he refused to compromise. He cast Dirk Bogarde and Helmut Berger to embody a collapsing dynasty whose pursuit of dominance becomes a metaphor for national guilt. During editing, Italian authorities tried to suppress its release, claiming it insulted national dignity. Despite bans and censorship, The Damned gained international acclaim for its fearless confrontation of evil as ordinary. Its imagery inspired filmmakers like Bernardo Bertolucci and Rainer Fassbinder. The film proved that cinema could portray decadence not as entertainment, but as a moral autopsy of a generation. Visconti's vision remains timeless, an opera of corruption so bold it forced nations to confront what they most wanted to forget. Number 9. A Taste of Honey, 1961. In the gritty streets of northern England, A Taste of Honey changed cinema forever. Directed by Tony Richardson and based on Sheila Delaney's groundbreaking play, the film shattered every rule of British filmmaking. It told the story of Joe, a working-class teenager navigating loneliness in an industrial wasteland. What made it revolutionary was its honesty. It dared to show poverty-class struggle and forbidden friendship without disguise. The British Board of Film Censors was furious. The film depicted social realities polite society pretended did not exist. Its portrayal of interracial relationships and a kind-hearted gay character was unthinkable in early 60s Britain. Officials accused it of promoting immorality and corruption of youth. Richardson fought back, refusing to sanitize life for the middle class. Behind the scenes, the production faced constant scrutiny. The studio warned Richardson that audiences would revolt, but he stood by Delaney's raw dialogue and working-class authenticity. Filmed on location in smoky Manchester, it captured the fading heartbeat of post-war Britain. Rita Tushingham's performance as Jo won hearts across Europe, but also enraged conservative critics who called it kitchen sink filth. When it premiered, it became both scandal and sensation. Younger audiences saw their own lives reflected honestly for the first time. The establishment panicked because A Taste of Honey proved that truth could no longer be censored. It opened doors for the British New Wave, influencing everything from Saturday Night and Sunday Morning to Kes. Today, it remains a symbol of empathy over propriety, proof that courage in art often means showing what the powerful prefer to hide. In its quiet black and white realism, A Taste of Honey whispered, the most dangerous message of all, that ordinary people's stories are worth telling. Number 8. Persona, 1966. Ingmar Bergman's Persona was not just a film, it was an exorcism of identity itself. Shot in austere black and white and stripped of conventional narrative, it told the story of two women, an actress who suddenly stops speaking, and a nurse who begins to lose herself while caring for her. What began as a psychological chamber piece became one of the most dissected and censored works in film history. When it premiered, censors across Europe froze in disbelief. There was no profanity or violence, yet the film's emotional rawness felt more dangerous than any act of rebellion. In Sweden, officials considered banning it for its suggestive imagery and its moral ambiguity. In America, several scenes were cut, including one brief moment that broke taboos of intimacy. But what truly disturbed audiences was not what was seen. It was what was implied. Behind the scenes, Bergman was suffering a mental and creative breakdown. Persona was born from his hospital recovery after collapsing on set months earlier. He poured his anxieties about existence and identity into every frame. The blurred faces, the monologues, the direct stare into the camera, all felt like cinematic heresy. The crew believed they were capturing madness itself. When it reached, critics' reactions were divided. Some called it meaningless, while others hailed it as a revelation. Decades later, it would be analyzed as one of the greatest achievements in world cinema. Persona broke censorship not through scandal, but through psychology. It proved that art could disturb without showing anything obscene. Its power was intellectual and spiritual rather than visual. Even today, audiences leave it shaken, uncertain whether they have watched a story or a confession. Persona remains the rare film that did not just challenge censorship, it dismantled reality itself. Number 7. Bonnie and Clyde, 1967. Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde blasted onto screens like a gunshot that never stopped echoing. Starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, the film reimagined the Depression-era outlaws as glamorous doomed lovers. But behind its beauty lurked a brutality that censors could not contain. The violence was shocking for its time. The blood, balletic, the deaths slow and cinematic. It was art and carnage intertwined. The Motion Picture Association nearly refused to classify it. American critics were outraged. The New York Times called it sick. The Catholic Legion of Decency demanded it be banned entirely. Yet young audiences flocked to see it again and again. They felt its rage, its rebellion, its contempt for authority. For them, Bonnie and Clyde was not criminal. It was revolutionary. Behind the scenes, chaos ruled. The studio executives at Warner Bros. Had no faith in the film and buried its initial release. But word of mouth revived it. By the end of the year, it was one of the highest-grossing films in America and had redefined modern cinema. The slow-motion death finale inspired generations of directors from Peckinpah to Scorsese. It also rewrote the rules of censorship. Before, Bonnie and Clyde filmmakers had to disguise violence. After it, they used violence as art form and commentary. The film marked the death of the old Hollywood code and the birth of the new rating system. Critics eventually hailed it as genius, but the moral outrage never entirely faded. In one breathtaking act of rebellion, Bonnie and Clyde turned blood into poetry and censorship into history. Number 6. The Devils, 1969. No film tested the boundaries of censorship more violently than Ken Russell's The Devils. Inspired by Aldous Huxley's The Devils of Loudun, it dramatized a true story from 17th century France, where political corruption and hysteria consumed a convent. Oliver Reed starred as Father Urbain Grandier, and Vanessa Redgrave as Sister Jeanne, a woman driven mad by obsession. From its first screening, the film was labeled dangerous, blasphemous, and obscene. Warner Bros. Executives tried to bury it even before release. The British Board of Film Censors demanded over 30 cuts. The Vatican condemned it outright. Entire reels were banned from television for decades. Russell refused to apologize. He claimed the film was about power and hypocrisy, not faith. Behind the scenes, production was a war zone. Sets designed by Derek Jarman resembled brutalist cathedrals of concrete and flame. The actors fainted under the heat of staged exorcisms. Russell pushed them into emotional extremes to portray the insanity of institutional control. Even after release, the studio continued to censor it, re-editing and hiding footage for years. When it finally resurfaced in its near-complete form, audiences saw what had terrified censors. It was not the imagery, but the truth. The Devils exposed how religion, politics, and fear worked together to control humanity. It was banned for blasphemy, but its real crime was honesty. Today, it stands as one of the most censored films in history, yet also one of the most vital. Few films have been so feared or so prophetic. The Devils did what censorship could not erase. It made rebellion sacred. Number 5. Midnight Cowboy, 1969. When Midnight Cowboy hit theaters, it did not just shock audiences, it dismantled the moral walls that had contained American cinema for decades. Directed by John Schlesinger and starring Jon Voight and Dustin Hoffman, the film followed Joe Buck, a naive Texan who travels to New York, dreaming of charm and fortune, only to find himself lost in the city's grime alongside a sickly con man named Ratso Rizzo. It was the first major studio film to receive an X rating, yet it won the Academy Award for Best Picture, a contradiction that defined a new era of creative freedom. Censors were horrified, not by violence, but by despair. They feared its honesty, the way it showed loneliness, hunger, and human failure without glamour. It stripped America's fantasy bare, revealing a nation in spiritual decay. Production itself was an act of rebellion. Schlesinger filmed on the streets guerrilla style, using real passers-by without permission. The grit was not set dressing. It was reality captured in motion. Jon Voight's innocence and Hoffman's unforgettable cry of "I'm walking here" turned raw survival into poetry. Critics were divided between disgust and awe. The Catholic Legion of Decency called it immoral, yet younger audiences saw it as liberation. Behind closed doors, the studio panicked. They feared boycotts and bans. But word spread fast. The film was unfiltered truth from a country waking up from its own illusions. When it swept the Oscars, it became a statement. The old censorship codes were dead. Midnight Cowboy proved that honesty could not be legislated away. Its legacy still haunts modern cinema. It opened doors for directors like Scorsese, Coppola, and Friedkin to tell stories without fear. Midnight Cowboy was not just bold. It was the final bullet that killed censorship and the first light of the American New Wave. Number 4. 8-1-2, 1963. Federico Fellini's 8-1-2 was the dream that scandalized the soul of cinema. It told the story of Guido Anselmi, a filmmaker paralyzed by creative exhaustion, drifting through fantasy, memory, and desire. But what enraged censors was not content. It was the chaos of honesty. Fellini dared to show confusion as art and self-doubt, as spectacle in a decade obsessed with control and clarity. The Vatican condemned it for moral ambiguity. Italian critics called it obscene for its portrayal of women as symbols of imagination and guilt. Some theaters banned it outright, fearing it would corrupt youth. Yet every frame shimmered with personal confession. Fellini turned his own artistic crisis into a surreal labyrinth of mirrors, where sin and beauty became indistinguishable. Behind the scenes, Fellini faced near collapse. He rewrote the script, daily changing direction as inspiration struck. The producers panicked, believing they were funding madness. Marcello Mastroianni followed him without question, embodying the director's alter ego, a man lost in fame and fantasy. The result was a cinematic revolution. Audiences were divided. Some booed at premieres, others stood in reverence. Within months, it became an international triumph, winning the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film and cementing Fellini as cinema's poet of the subconscious. Yet even decades later, censors in conservative nations continued to restrict it, not for explicit content, but for its existential threat. It encouraged thinking without obedience. 8. 1-2 remains one of the most dissected films ever made. It whispered that art could question God, fame, and self all at once. Its influence reached every filmmaker who dared to dream on screen. What once offended morality now defines genius, a film so bold it turned confusion into beauty and censorship into irrelevance. Number 3. Eyes Without a Face, 1960. Before European horror found poetry in the grotesque, there was Georges Franju's Eyes Without a Face. Released in 1960, it told the story of a surgeon obsessed with restoring his daughter's disfigured face through forbidden operations. Audiences expected a gothic thriller. What they got instead was a haunting tragedy that made censors recoil. In France, the first screenings caused fainting and walkouts. British censors delayed release for 2 years, claiming it was too graphic for civilized audiences. The infamous operation sequence, shot with chilling precision, was considered unbearable even by hardened critics. Yet beyond its shock lay sorrow and beauty. Franju treated horror as heartbreak, not spectacle. Behind the scenes, producers begged him to tone it down. He refused. He wanted to show the price of obsession and the fragility of identity. Edith Scobb's ethereal performance behind the porcelain mask became legendary. She was both angel and ghost, a figure of purity trapped in violation. The film's ban in several countries only added to its mystique. Critics who dismissed it as sadistic later recognized it as a masterpiece of atmosphere and emotion. It influenced filmmakers from Pedro Almodovar to John Woo and even inspired future sci-fi body horror from Cronenberg and Carpenter. Eyes Without a Face was too elegant to be pulp and too disturbing to be art house. It broke the rule that horror must either entertain or moralize. It did neither. Instead, it left audiences grieving, unsure whether to weep for the victims or the villains. Censors wanted to destroy it, but in silencing it, they made it immortal. Today, it stands as one of the boldest films of the 60s, a work that proved beauty and horror are sometimes the same thing. Number 2, Last Year at Marienbad, 1961. When Alain Resnais released Last Year at Marienbad, he didn't just confuse audiences, he enraged censors, philosophers, and critics alike. The film took place inside an ornate European hotel where time dissolved, memory blurred, and identity fractured. A man insists he met a woman there a year before, but she claims no such meeting happened. The result was hypnotic, maddening, and revolutionary. Censors didn't know what to do with it. There was no violence, no indecency, just a dream that refused to make sense. French officials debated banning it for being morally subversive. They claimed its structure mocked order itself, that its nonlinear storytelling would encourage intellectual chaos. In Britain, critics accused it of being pretentious corruption. Yet audiences lined up in curiosity just to see what the controversy meant. Behind the scenes, Resnais and writer Alain Robbe-Grillet built the film like a labyrinth of mirrors. Every take was rehearsed for precision, but no emotion was explained. Actors Delphine Seyrig and Giorgio Albertazzi were given ambiguous direction, told to behave as if time didn't exist. The result was a cinematic hallucination, an experience that critics described as both punishment and revelation. When it won the Golden Lion at Venice, the audience split in fury. Some booed, others wept. To the censors' horror, the film was being discussed in universities as serious art. It was banned from television broadcast for years in several countries because authorities feared it would confuse the public. But confusion was the point. Last Year at Marienbad became a monument of cinematic courage. It proved that rules, narrative, and censorship could all be illusions. Its influence seeped into Kubrick's The Shining Lynch's Lost Highway and Nolan's Inception. What began as a scandal ended as prophecy, an assertion that cinema's truest rebellion is mystery itself. Number 1. Peeping Tom, 1960. No film in the 1960s destroyed a director's career faster, or more completely, than Peeping Tom. Directed by Michael Powell, it told the story of a shy cameraman who murders women while filming their dying expressions. Released the same year as Hitchcock's Psycho, it should have made Powell a legend. Instead, it ended his career in exile. The British press erupted in outrage. Headlines screamed, evil and perverse. Critics called for Powell's arrest. The film was banned across much of the United Kingdom and suppressed by its own distributor. Yet, today, it is considered one of the boldest psychological thrillers ever made. The irony could not be darker. What terrified censors was not gore, but reflection. Powell turned the camera on the audience itself, suggesting that everyone who watched cinema shared the voyeur's guilt. In an era obsessed with moral respectability, that idea was unthinkable. Critics branded it a sickness. Even after heavy cuts, no theater wanted to show it. Powell's name was erased from future projects, and he spent years in creative exile before Scorsese and Coppola revived his reputation decades later. Behind the lens, Peeping Tom was made with exquisite craft. Its colors were vivid, its psychology precise, its empathy unsettling. The protagonist was not a monster, but a mirror, a lonely soul consumed by the need to see more than he should. The censors saw their own reflection and recoiled. Years later, when film scholars revisited it, they realized what Powell had achieved. He predicted the age of surveillance and obsession with image. He had made the first true meta-horror film decades before the term existed. What once ruined him became his redemption. Peeping Tom was banned for being too honest about what cinema is, a gaze both beautiful and cruel. In exposing the watcher, it revealed the darkest truth of all, that censorship hides not from corruption, but from recognition. The 60s were more than rebellion. They were revelation. Each of these 17 films cracked open the walls of censorship, exposing fear disguised as morality. They changed what stories could be told and what truths could be shown. Which of these daring masterpieces do you think broke the biggest barrier? Comment your choice and join us for more hidden cinematic revolutions.